Make no mistake, the tragedy unfolding in Australia is climate change based.
Well, perhaps that's a conclusion best left to the experts, rather than an acceptance speech at the Golden Globes. So let's hear the scientific conclusion from Australia's leading climate scientist.
Climate change isn't the cause of these bushfires.
Wait, my mistake, this isn't Australia's leading climate scientist, it's plain old TV commentator Peter Credlin, also not an expert. Aren't there any real researchers out there who can give us an expert conclusion? We seem to be inundated with pundits all over the world who've suddenly found Australia on a map.
It's over your left shoulder, mate.
And decided that after 5 minutes surfing the internet, they know what's causing the bushfires, and of course they think we're in dire need of their McExpert opinion. So let me start by saying that I'm no more of an expert than they are, so I'm not going to set myself up as one or make up my own theories. As always, I'm going to report the science. The real experts will tell you that the link between climate change and bushfires is complicated. But let's look at this through the eyes of the amateurs and take a closer look at what the science says in response, starting with the excuse that we're not seeing anything new.
Nothing to see here, please, experts. Nothing to see here, please.
See that this nation, this state, has seen similar conditions and similar disasters many, many times over.
The fact none of these bushfires were in any way extraordinary compared to not just the last 50 years, but indeed the last 150 years, was an inconvenient truth.
Yes, apparently it's the normal climate of Australia. Not exactly a new phenomenon in Australia. And of course that's true. Australia has always had bushfires, droughts and heat waves. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a single scientific study that disagrees. But what climate researchers want to know, and I would have thought this was pretty obvious, is whether temperatures have been rising and whether the heat waves, droughts and fires have been getting worse. One way to find out if it was hotter in the past is to go back over old newspaper clippings and see if you can find heat waves or very hot days on different dates in different parts of the country.
Now let's look at an Australian heatwave which occurred 80 years ago.
They're easy to find, but of course they don't tell us much. Australia is a huge continent, so cherry-picking a record temperature in one particular town doesn't tell you what's happening in the rest of the country, or the rest of that year, let alone over several decades. That's why experts don't do it that way. They take national annual averages and build up a complete picture. And by including all the data, this is the complete picture, and right away you can see the obvious warming trend. This reconstruction from Berkeley Earth shows a 12-month moving average in grey and a 10-year moving average in red. And this one, which is a straight plot of average annual temperatures over time, comes from the Bureau of Meteorology. And that's how the BOM determined that December 17th, 2019 was the hottest day on record thus far.
So when BOM says it was the hottest day on record, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean going back 20 years, 30 years, 50 years?
Well, it means that the average temperature across the whole country, taking data from all the weather stations, shows that up to that time, December 17th, 2019 was the hottest on record. And since the Bureau of Meteorology's records began in 1910, that means since 1910, unless the BOM specifies otherwise.
The Bureau of Meteorology is claiming that Australia's hottest day on record came on a day when Bourke was 24 degrees below their all-time record maximum. That doesn't sound very credible to me.
Yeah, but that's why this data analysis is best left to qualified professionals. A record high average doesn't mean that every single weather station has to hit a record high temperature on that day. It means that the average of all the weather stations is at a record high. Most will be below their individual all-time highs. That's especially true of Bourke, which unofficially recorded Australia's hottest ever temperature of 51.7 degrees centigrade in 1909. The reading is thought to be a mistake, but even if it's accurate, Bourke is very unlikely to match that record just because Australia's national average hits a record high. Climate doesn't work that way. It's a big continent, and on that particular day the southeast of Australia, including Bourke, was influenced by a weather front in the Tasman Sea, and temperatures were mostly below average.
Temperatures haven't been significantly higher either. In fact, during the years 1899 to 1901, average December mean maximum temperatures were well above 38 degrees.
But why not read the caption on your own graph? This isn't the mean temperature for Australia. It's the data from just one weather station. Don't they teach the concept of averages in schools anymore? You have to look at the average annual temperature data, not just cherry-pick one place and 1 month that gives you the result you want. The only way you can dismiss this pretty clear temperature rise is to believe that there's a conspiracy to cook up fraudulent figures and somehow hide the real ones.
Note that the weather girl is cleverly standing in front of Eastern Australia, and it wasn't particularly hot over there on December 17th.
So that's how they hide below average temperatures, by sticking a weather girl in front of them. What a cunning plan! Simple, yet brilliant. I guess from now on I'll check the weather the way most Aussies do, from the numerous TV forecasts we get every day where weather presenters can't get in the way. Well, unless you live in Mexico, where it's unavoidable. Time for Hide the Data Plan B.
But if we look at the Bureau of Meteorology's temperature graph for Australia, you can see they begin in 1910. They hide all of the extremely hot weather which occurred prior to then.
Well, certainly sounds devious, but instead of jumping straight to the conclusion that there's a conspiracy, why not simply find out the reason? It only requires a little bit of effort because the answer's right there on the Bureau of Meteorology website. The BOM didn't have any data before 1910 because it only started operations in 1908. And while your next question will probably be, well, why didn't they show other data that had been collected before they were founded? The answer to that is also pretty easy. They do. The data for all the stations prior to 1910 is freely available on the Bureau of Meteorology website. In fact, we've already seen one, and there's also an historical reconstruction based on that data, also on the BOM website, compiled by Berkeley Earth. The problem, as you can see, is that the readings have huge margins of error prior to 1910 because there was no standardization. Weather stations were using different instruments, taking readings at different times of day and under different conditions. So as soon as it was founded, the BOM standardized meteorological instruments and data gathering techniques all across Australia. So while the Bureau of Meteorology is happy to put all this pre-1910 data on its website for you to download, as well as reconstructions that use it, it does so with a warning that the data is not reliable. That's why it starts its own official records from the year of standardization, 1910. Actually, let's just get back to that page from their website. If you look at the value on the right-hand side, just after the year 2000, notice how what? They're hiding the figures! Not again! Damn your cunning tricks, Bureau of Meteorology! So obviously I can't show you that, but let's go on and look at the drought. It's a hard one to define because there are so many different ways of measuring it. But if we take rainfall alone, there's no evidence that Australia is getting less rain and no reason why it should. What's happening is that rainfall patterns are changing. If we start looking at patterns from 1950, about the time temperatures began rising, eastern and southwestern parts of Australia, which are the big population and agricultural centres, seem to be getting drier, while the north and northwest are getting wetter. And that's been confirmed by scientific studies, which we'll look at more closely later in the video. So that brings us on to the most relevant trend, the fires themselves. Is the 2019-2020 fire season perfectly normal? Australia's acting and retired fire chiefs, each with a lifetime experience fighting bushfires, came together to warn the government, no, this is not normal.
Never before have we had 17 concurrent emergency warning fires burning at once.
So there's something going on.
And that's supported by scientific studies. The best way to quantify this is to look at the FFDI, the Forest Fire Danger Index, which measures the likelihood of fires breaking out based on rainfall, evaporation, humidity, temperature, and other factors. At least 2 studies have shown that the FFDI has been trending upwards. This 2007 study is interesting because it not only found that the FFDI rose for the previous 3 decades, but it predicted that fire weather conditions would worsen, increasing the FFDI between 4 and 25% by 2020. That's now. And this study found that the FFDI increased significantly in nearly half the stations it checked between 1973 and 2010, a clear upward trend. All of which means, yes, there is something to see here. So the next excuse is, but it's not climate change, it's arsonists.
What was the arson element of this story? That was my...
Oh my God, now we've got 5 bloody armchair experts.
I mean, it's hard to tell what's true or not. I see pictures of people who allegedly set the fires and they're running away, and there's 50 people in jail on charges of arson or something in Australia, but they've been charged, but have they been found guilty yet? I don't know.
Aren't some of the arsonists climate nutters though as well?
Guess what the primary cause of these fires was? People deliberately starting the fires.
Now that may be true, but it isn't. You can't just make stuff up out of thin air, you have to check the figures. According to the Australian Institute of Criminology, from September 2019 to December 2019, which was when you decided we needed the benefit of your McExpert opinion, only around 13% of fires were started by arson. That's hardly the primary cause. It's possible many of the 36% of fires deemed suspicious may turn out to be arson. We don't know.
And there's loads of articles talking about how now the fires are being blamed on arsonists.
I'm sure there are, but that doesn't mean it's true. James Dellingpole, a columnist for Breitbart News who never studied science past playing with Newton's balls at prep school, thinks there are 180 arsonists. This guy thinks there are 183 arsonists, and he even knows the political philosophy of every one. Apparently they're all leftists. This figure, either 183, more than 180, or nearly 200, has been going round the blogosphere so many times that Donald Trump Jr. picked up on it and tweeted it to thousands of his followers. In Australia, it's known as a furphy. Or to put it in words that the McExperts understand,
it's all total bullshit.
So where does this figure come from? Well, it started with a completely false headline in the Australian newspaper. Firebugs fueling crisis as national arson arrest toll hits 183. The Australian is published by Rupert Murdoch, so accuracy is not exactly a priority. The Australian cites its source as a New South Wales police report, so let's go to the source and, yes, you're way ahead of me, discover how the headline writers got it wrong. Turns out these weren't 183 cases of arson, they were 183 cases of fire-related incidents in New South Wales. Only 24 people were charged with arson, 57 had legal action, which could be as simple as a caution for failing to comply with the total fire ban, for example by lighting campfires or barbecues, or even operating machinery in areas where a fire ban is in place. And 47 were cautioned or charged with discarding matches or lit cigarettes on the ground. So 24 alleged arsonists gets bumped up to 183 and then rounded up to nearly 200. You have to read past the fake headlines to see the actual figures buried in the body of these stories, which of course most armchair experts can't be bothered to do. But okay, even 24 of these huge fires is nothing to scoff at. And there are many more suspected arson attacks where the perpetrators haven't been caught. But it turns out that arsonists aren't responsible for most of these big fires. According to the experts, remember them? The most common cause is not arson or discarded cigarettes or any form of human activity. The most common cause by far is lightning strikes. Inspector Ben Shepherd of the New South Wales Rural Fire Service said, "I can confidently say the majority of larger fires we've been dealing with have been the result of fires coming out of remote areas as a result of dry lightning storms." According to Brett Mitchell, CFA incident controller in Bairnsdale, East Gippsland, where some of the worst fires occurred, most of the fires have been caused by lightning. And Victoria's fire chief says dry lightning, not arson, is the main cause of the state's destructive bushfires. But how can that be, you ask, if the statistics I've just quoted show that natural causes like lightning strikes are only responsible for starting about 6% of the fires? Well, because not all fires are equal. One fire might be huge, another might be tiny. Most fires started accidentally or deliberately by humans are quickly spotted and in places that are easily accessible to fire trucks. Fires from lightning strikes tend to start in remote areas of thick forest and bushland, where there's lots of fuel and they're hard to reach and hard to control. They're the ones burning up millions of acres of forest and becoming unstoppable as they advance on small towns. That's why the fire chiefs are saying it's lightning that's responsible for these large fires. Most arson offences relate to small grass fires and things like rubbish bins set alight. In Victoria, only about 0.03% of the millions of acres burned was due to arson. And none of South Australia's deadliest or most destructive fires are being treated as suspicious. That doesn't mean to say arson isn't a serious problem. Arsonists are a bloody menace, and sometimes they are responsible for destroying homes and even killing people. But unfortunately, they're nothing new. What's different between this season and last season is not the sudden appearance of an army of arsonists, but a long period of drought, record high air temperature, and a higher forest fire danger index, which are all part of a growing trend. So when lightning strikes, these hot, dry forests erupt in flame. So the objective of this disinformation campaign seems to be to take attention away from these worsening fire conditions and blame Australians themselves for starting these fires, which is not only misleading, but insulting. And if that doesn't work, well, find someone else to blame.
Okay, so who knows about this?
I have something.
I think you can guess this isn't going to turn out well.
I was reading a paper the other day, and one of the stories was about how actually the reason that the fires are getting so bad is they stopped doing controlled burns.
Yeah. Well, it's a classic example of land management issue, isn't it? They're not clearing the undergrowth, they're not doing controlled burns.
Because green environmentalist policies have outlawed property owners doing controlled burns that create fire breaks to prevent infernos spreading.
What's happening is radical left-wing environmentalists in Australia are stopping the country from conducting the controlled burns it needs to keep these wildfires from happening.
Turns out he's referencing a Breitbart News op-ed by our old friend James Dellingpole, the political commentator, and it got passed around the internet by everybody else. So let's inject a few facts into this maelstrom of ignominious ignorance. Firstly, the Green Party, which is pretty representative of the Greenies in Australia, supports prescribed burns. It says so in its manifesto. Secondly, the fire chiefs, and in case you've forgotten, they're the experts, not the pommy politicos, say this is not a problem they face.
The single biggest impediment to completing hazard reduction burning is the weather. And with longer fire seasons, earlier starts and later finishes to fire seasons, like we've been experiencing over recent times, you get a shrinking window of opportunity for more favourable hazard reduction burning periods. And in that shrinking window, you get the extremes of it can be too wet and too cold to effectively get hazard reduction burns done, through to it being too hot and too dry and therefore too dangerous.
Look, it's very clear, and any fire service will tell you that the windows for hazard reduction through the winter are getting narrower and narrower. Now, a slight lift in temperature overall, average temperature, means the extremes are more extreme.
Burn. We can't light a burn and just let it run. Lighting a hazard reduction burn is complicated, it's resource hungry, it's risky, and the minute we see a burn lit, I end up getting inundated with claims for people wanting us to pay for their shade cloth on their greenhouse. The sun tuff on their back pergola's now got embers that have landed on it. So there's so many ramifications that come from prescribed burning. Hazard reduction has a place and is a valuable tool for day-to-day fires, for normal seasons. But when you've got a really tough season, when you've got awful fire weather conditions, so when you're running fires under severe, extreme or worse conditions, hazard reduction has very little effect at all on fire spread. It's only when the conditions back off a little bit, generally speaking overnight, or when the severe, extreme or catastrophic conditions get right back to, say, very high, that you've actually got some prospect of slowing the fire spread. So it's important, but not the panacea, and something that we should have a very open and frank discussion about.
The other point here is about all the emotion around these fuel reduction burns. The reality is I am concerned, and it's interesting now my peer in New South Wales has said come out quite strongly, Shane Fitzsimmons, and said exactly the same thing, which is essentially we can't see these fuel reduction burns as a silver bullet. Yes, they are. Yes, we need to do fuel reduction burns, but they're not going to solve all our problems. So, example in Gippsland, where we had a fuel reduction burn go through in 2014, didn't slow this fire up at all.
And I can say, in any given year, of all the burns that we've got ready to go, 70 or 80% are cleared, environmentally ready to go. We're just waiting for the window of opportunity. We've gone from completing, lucky to be 40 or 50% of our annual burn programs to now up to 80 or 90% of our burn programs.
And according to the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, the main reason for the increase is not the successful quashing of greenie protests, but increased funding for the crews that do this hazard reduction work. Sorry, carry on, Shane.
If there's a risk in an area and it needs treating with hazard reduction work, we can serve notices on private and public landholders to get that work done.
Yes, burning is important, but some of the hysteria that this will be the problem that solves, or the solution to all our problems, is really just quite an emotional load of rubbish, to be honest.
The figures back all that up. In its most recent annual report, the New South Wales Rural Fire Service said it had planned 19,896 prescribed burns and carried out 16,556 of them. That's 83%. I'm sure people will post anecdotal tales on the forum of how they weren't allowed to remove trees or burn bush on their own properties, but every council is different. Every neighbourhood is different. This is the view from my backyard. We've had to evacuate twice as forest fires got close, so I'd love to do a prescribed burn every couple of years in our wooded area that backs onto a national forest, or have the fire service come in and do it. But even if conditions were right during the short time period available between ever-lengthening fire seasons, the biggest objections would come from my neighbours. Not because they're greenies, but because they're worried that a prescribed burn might get out of control and destroy their $500,000 houses. That does happen. Regardless of individual cases, what these trained and experienced fire chiefs are explaining is the overall picture of the difficulties they face in carrying out prescribed burns, the success they've had despite these difficulties, the increased rates of hazard reduction, the fact that these prescribed burns aren't a panacea anyway, and their frustration at the way armchair critics are getting emotional over the issue rather than looking at the facts. And when the blame game runs out, it's finally time to face the question of whether climate change might be contributing to this.
If you're into science and facts, you have to accept that the nation's most preeminent experts say there's no direct link between this drought and climate change. There's no long-term drying trend.
Now, the first part of that is true. Most experts say you can't attribute a single drought or a single weather event to climate change. For example, let's hear from Sarah Perkins-Kirkpatrick, a senior researcher on climate at the University of New South Wales.
So the last few winters we've had really low rainfall, and that's obviously what's ignited the drought, and it's perpetuated for that amount of time. But we can't really find a signal due to natural variability in there, nor climate change. It's not to say neither of one of those is driving it. It's just not as obvious as what we would expect it to be.
But the second part of Sky News' claim,
the nation's most preeminent experts say there's no long-term drying trend,
is incorrect. Here are some of the nation's most preeminent climate experts, and that's exactly what they say. They condensed their published research into a report in plain language that even arts graduates and political commentators can understand. Climate change is likely making drought conditions in southwest and southeast Australia worse. In Australia, it's clear that climate change has reduced rainfall in the southeast and southwest corners of the continent. Precipitation patterns have changed markedly over the past 2 decades, with a pronounced drying trend in these 2 important agricultural regions. So, which experts is he getting his information from?
Well, I listen to scientists, and my key source is Professor Andy Pittman, who's a world-renowned expert in this area.
Well, maybe you're either not listening to Dr. Pittman, or you don't understand his research. In plain language, Dr. Pittman says higher temperatures don't lead directly to higher evaporation and a higher risk of drought, but he says they do lead to changes in rainfall patterns which can lead to drought. In some regions, says Dr. Pittman, global warming increases the risk of drought, and in other regions it decreases the risk, as we've already seen. Even the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes, where Dr. Pittman is director, had to issue a media release telling these TV and newspaper McExperts to stop misrepresenting him. Stop claiming our scientists and director Andy Pittman say there is no connection between drought and climate change. There is a connection, and unlike your public statements on climate change, it is nuanced. See here. Which is exactly what all the other experts are saying.
Droughts in the affected regions were caused by a natural weather phenomenon, the Indian Ocean dipole, not by man-made climate change.
Sorry, I accidentally injected a clip of another political commentator who's so knowledgeable about the Indian Ocean dipole he thinks it's called a dipole. It's almost as if he's just heard about it for the first time. And while this guy may sound like an expert because he addresses his army of loyal followers with authority and confidence, he's actually one of Australia's most famous political commentators and another McExpert who doesn't know an Indian Ocean dipole from a stripper's pole.
There is no reason why climate change should make the landscape more arid.
Well, of course, the experts say there is. You just have to understand it. And that means firstly understanding the three main natural climate patterns that govern Australia's rainfall. To the west, the Indian Ocean dipole.
The Indian Ocean dipole.
The Indian Ocean dipole is caused by a temperature differential between the western and eastern parts of the Indian Ocean, hence the word dipole.
Dipole.
Shut up. When it's in a negative phase, warmer water is closer to Australia and we get more rain. When it's in a positive phase, the opposite happens. To the east is the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, which has a similar temperature differential, changing rainfall patterns in eastern Australia. And to the south is the Southern Annular Mode, or the SAM, which pushes rain fronts into southern Australia in its negative mode, but keeps the rain back in its positive mode. So the worst droughts are caused when more than one of these weather patterns coincides by giving us the same dry conditions, and that's what's been happening recently with the AOD and the SAM. So if it's perfectly natural, why blame climate change? Because these phenomena are all driven by temperature, especially ocean temperature, which has been rising, hitting a record high in 2019. Time to hear again from a real expert.
Australia is known for its extremes, and without climate change, we're a land of extremes because of these variability things that influence us. So we know that at some point they're going to happen, but put climate change on top of that and it exacerbates those extremes even further. And it's not just something that we kind of knew about last year. Climate scientists have been talking about this for decades. So we expect to see more extreme heat. When we see flooding, we expect that to be more extreme. And when we get bushfires, we expect them to be more extreme too. And especially over eastern Australia. Over some parts of Australia, there's not really much of a signal. But over the southeast, longer fire seasons and more intense fires are conducive with climate change.
So what the experts are saying is that these are natural phenomena. They're what's driven Australian heat waves, droughts and bushfires in the past, but in the last few decades they've been happening on a rising platform of global temperature, which means that every weather event is more accentuated, from droughts and heat waves to rainfall and floods. Studies have shown the influence of global warming on these natural phenomena. Back in 2009, this study laid the blame for recent droughts on a positive Indian Ocean dipole exacerbated by rising temperatures. And the same year, this paper concluded that the Indian Ocean Dipole Index has been increasing along with regional temperatures, and concluded that climate change will increase the occurrence of positive IOD events. Those are the ones that cause drought. So if scientists are pointing the finger at climate change not as a cause but as an amplifier of natural causes, making heat waves, droughts and bushfires worse, what excuses are left to ignore it? Well, it's the old thoughts and prayers excuse. Now is not the time to talk about it.
My only thoughts today are with those who've lost their lives.
I certainly don't think it's appropriate to get into a political argument.
I'll tell you this, I'm not going to cop it. And if that's the rest of this interview, well, you've lost me for the morning.
The bushfire and climate change debate. It's dumb, it's reckless, it's offensive.
Well, now is not the time to be talking about climate change.
So here's the problem the Australian government faces. It has to run a tightrope between appeasing voters, who are mostly calling for action, and powerful members of its parliamentary party who either want to downplay the role of climate change or don't even accept the basic science. And this is the Deputy Prime Minister about to answer the question, do you agree that there needs to be further action on climate change? Now, the answer is either yes or no, and saying no to taking action is never a good political move. But if he says yes, he knows the follow-up question is going to be, OK, what sort of further action will you take? When a politician knows an uncomfortable follow-up question is coming, he'll stall it at all costs by droning on at length about other topics without pausing for a breath, so the reporters have no chance of interrupting to ask a question again. Let's watch the masterclass in how that's done.
There's been a lot of hysteria around climate change. Climate change isn't the only factor that has caused these fires. There's been dry lightning strikes, there's been self-combusting piles of manure. There's been a lot of arsonists out there.
Throw in the arsonist excuse. Good. You can use up to a minute on that.
Somebody who is deliberately lighting a fire to cause mischief, indeed potentially property damage and even death, should be dobbed in to Crime Stoppers on 1800 333 000. And if somebody sees a fire...
The reason a politician rambles on like this is not because he's forgotten the question. He's hoping the reporter will forget the question and instead follow something else the politician mentions in his diatribe. Or he's hoping to simply run down the clock. The journalist would have been told by a ministerial aide that this is only a 10-minute doorstop, and on the 10-minute mark the aide will step in and tell the minister he's expected at his next appointment. So all the politician has to do is keep talking. How's he getting on?
By a person in authority that they actually heed those warnings.
But I'll put you out of your misery. When he eventually stopped talking, the reporter asked exactly the same question again, and the Deputy Prime Minister was forced to admit that more needed to be done. But of course the government's argument is there's no point, because there's nothing we can do about it anyway.
Australia is responsible for just 1.3% of global emissions.
The real problem, it seems, was that the Morrison government hadn't magically turned down the world's temperature by cutting Australia's tiny emissions.
And even if the entire planet turned carbon neutral tomorrow, we would still have summers like this, we would still have fires like this.
For once, the experts agree. Taking action on CO2 emissions now won't stop the megafires we're dealing with now. The time to have taken action to avoid today's megafires was in the 1980s, when the world's politicians first recognized the problem. But they decided to kick the can down the road because they knew that the effects of any CO2 reduction policies they took then would be decades away, and they were more concerned about the next general election. And government politicians are doing the same thing today. The effects of any policies they introduce now won't be felt for another 30 years, and their political careers will be over by then. When the fires abate at the end of this season and this drought finally ends, as it inevitably will, they can proclaim that the crisis is over. As droughts, heat waves and megafires continue to become more frequent and more intense, they'll just hope it'll be someone else's problem. As for the argument that Australia only contributes 1.3% of anthropogenic CO2, that's also true. Even if Australia stopped emitting CO2 altogether, it would make very little difference to the global warming trend. But France is only responsible for 0.9% of the world's CO2 emissions, Germany 2.1%, Japan 3.6%. If every country took a view that it doesn't have to do anything because its own CO2 emissions are just a fraction of the total, nothing would ever get done. We'd just expect China to do it alone, and China could then use the argument that its emissions per capita are only 7.7 tonnes a year, less than half those of Australia. So solving an international problem requires international cooperation. Australia has diplomatic clout in the world, and shunning summit meetings on climate change and thwarting international climate agreements by demanding privileged loopholes is not making Australia popular, and it isn't even in our own self-interest. This country stands to benefit more than most from the energy revolution. When an international agreement is made, South Korea and Japan want to build economies based on hydrogen fuel made in Australia, because we have a wealth of clean, renewable energy. It's not going to cost us anything, but what is costing us is the result of government inaction 40 years ago.
And there's nothing that Australia can or ever will do that will change the global climate.
But of course, again, scientists disagree. Researchers since 1896 have shown conclusively that increasing CO2 concentration raises global temperature. To all those who doubt that, don't just read magazine stories, Read the science. And scientific studies have been warning for decades that this is going to increase climatic extremes in Australia, including bushfires. So what scientists have been urging for the last 4 decades is that to mitigate these droughts, heat waves and megafires, you need to reduce the concentration of the gas that's making them more and more extreme. So finally, what do I think is the cause of these bushfires? Well, I'll tell you. It doesn't matter. Neither my amateur opinion nor the opinions of amateurs in videos, blogs, TV commentaries, pubs, clubs and knitting circles matter when it comes to science. Especially when all most amateurs are doing is simply quoting from each other and passing round nonsense beliefs that's at variance with the facts. So I'm going to leave the last word with one of those researchers.
I don't want to say I told you so. No climate scientist does, but that kind of sits there. You're like, well, this is not a surprise to us. It's still utterly devastating, and it breaks my heart to see my country on fire. It really does. It was just a matter of time when this perfect storm happened. And the thing is, as we move further into the future and the climate warms even more, what's going to happen then? Sure, climate variability will have a role. It always has a role. But if it's 2 or 3 degrees hotter, not just 1 degree hotter, how bad can it really get? And I guess that's what concerns me the most. Not how bad it is now, but how bad it will be in the future.